What happens when a morning show host who built his career in political journalism decides to put one of the most fearless comedians of his generation on trial for the crime of making people uncomfortable? What you're about to witness is one of the most electrifying confrontations ever captured on morning television. The moment when Dave Chappelle, the man who walked away from $50 million because he refused to compromise his art, reminded America why he's been called the greatest stand-up comedian alive. Studio transformed into a battleground between comedy and political correctness. The questions were designed to corner him. The comedian refused to be cornered, and George Stephanopoulos discovered that some people have been fighting for free expression too long to back down. Now, before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments, because this confrontation will challenge everything you think you know about comedy, controversy, and the courage to speak your mind. Times Square studio carried an unusual tension that Wednesday morning. Word had spread that Dave Chappelle was the guest, and the energy was palpably different from the usual cheerful morning show atmosphere. There were producers who looked nervous. There were executives who had made phone calls. Everyone knew that Dave Chappelle was unpredictable, uncontrollable, and utterly unafraid of saying exactly what he thought regardless of the consequences. When Dave Chappelle walked onto the set, the contrast with the bright sanitized GMA aesthetic was immediate and striking. At 51 years old, he moved with the easy confidence of a man who had absolutely nothing left to prove. He was dressed simply in dark clothes, a cigarette presumably just extinguished moments before entering. His famous face carrying the weight of someone who had seen the best and worst of American fame and emerged with his soul intact. Robin Roberts greeted him with professional warmth, though there was a carefulness in her demeanor that suggested she knew this interview could go anywhere. Michael Strahan, himself, a man who understood performance and pressure, offered a respectful nod. But George Stephanopoulos sat in his anchor chair with an expression that longtime viewers would recognize. It was the look he wore when he was preparing to conduct a serious interrogation. "Dave Chappelle, welcome to Good Morning America," Robin began. "It's been quite a journey since Chappelle's show. We're excited to talk about your new projects and your incredible career in comedy." "Thank you, Robin," Dave replied, his voice carrying that distinctive laid-back cadence that could shift from conversational to devastating in an instant. "I appreciate being here. It's early, I won't lie. Comedians aren't usually awake at this hour." The audience laughed warmly, but George wasn't interested in warm-up material. "Dave, let's get into something substantive," George said, leaning forward with the intensity he usually reserved for interviewing politicians. "Your recent Netflix specials have generated enormous controversy. Critics say you've used your platform to punch down at marginalized communities, particularly the transgender community. Some say you've become the thing you used to mock, a powerful person using his platform to attack people with less power. How do you respond to that?" The question was clearly designed to put Dave on the defensive immediately. The studio atmosphere shifted. Robin's smile tightened. Michael's expression became unreadable. Dave, however, simply tilted his head slightly, studying George with the same analytical gaze he brought to dissecting American culture on stage. "That's quite an opening question, George," Dave said calmly. "Most people start with, 'How are you?' or 'What's new?' But I appreciate the directness. Let me be equally direct. I'm a comedian. My job is to make observations about the world and find the humor in them. Sometimes those observations make people uncomfortable. That discomfort is often where the best comedy lives. But there's a difference between discomfort and harm." George pressed. "Activists say your jokes contribute to real-world violence against trans people, that your platform amplifies hatred, that comedy doesn't exist in a vacuum." Dave was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that silenced the studio. "I've been doing comedy for over 30 years. I've joked about race, religion, politics, sex, drugs, violence, and every other aspect of human existence. I've made jokes about my own community that some people found offensive. I've made jokes about white people, about black people, about everyone. That's what comedians do. We hold up a mirror to society and point out the absurdities." He leaned forward slightly. "Now suddenly I'm supposed to believe that one community is completely off limits. That making any observation about any aspect of their experience is automatically violence. That's not how comedy works, George. That's not how free speech works, and that's not how I work. But don't you have a responsibility given your platform to consider the impact of your words? George continued, "You're not some unknown comedian in a club. You're Dave Chappelle. Millions of people hear what you say. Doesn't that come with obligations?" Oblations to whom? Dave asked, his voice sharpening. To the activists who've decided they get to determine what's acceptable. To the Twitter mobs who try to cancel anyone who steps out of line. To the corporations who will drop you the moment you become controversial. He shook his head slowly. I walked away from $50 million because I felt like I was losing control of my own voice. 50 million, George. Do you know how much money that was in 2005? And I walked away because I refused to let other people tell me what I could and couldn't say. You think I'm going to start taking orders now? He paused, letting the weight of that decision settle over the studio. People thought I was crazy. My own family thought I was crazy. I went to Africa to clear my head. And the media said I was on drugs, that I'd lost my mind. But I knew something was wrong. I knew that I was becoming a product instead of an artist. And I chose my sanity over their money. His voice grew quieter but more intense. That's who I am, George. I'm the guy who walked away from everything rather than compromise. So when you ask me to apologize for jokes, to change my material, to become safer and more acceptable, you're asking me to become someone I've already proven I'm not willing to be. The reference to his famous departure from comedy's central landed with weight. George shifted tactics. But some would say that walking away was about artistic integrity. What you're doing now, they argue, isn't art. It's just provocation. You're not challenging power. You're using your power to challenge people who are already vulnerable. Dave laughed. But there was an edge to it. Do you want to talk about power? Let's talk about power. I'm a black man in America. I grew up watching my community be stereotyped, mocked, imprisoned, and killed. I used comedy to address those issues when it wasn't popular, when it was dangerous, when people told me I was being too political. His voice was rising now. And now you're going to lecture me about punching down. I've spent my entire career punching up at racism, at the criminal justice system, at police brutality, at the hypocrisy of American society. I was talking about these issues when most people in media were looking the other way. He pointed at George. But the moment I make some jokes that a certain group doesn't like, suddenly I'm the bully. Suddenly, I'm the one with too much power. That's not consistency, George. That's selective outrage. Robin tried to intervene. Maybe we should talk about your upcoming tour. No, Robin, let's stay with this, Dave said, his eyes never leaving George's face. Because this is the real conversation, isn't it? This is what everyone wants to talk about but is too afraid to say directly. So, let's have it out right here, right now. George seemed to accept the challenge. Fine. Let's talk about your joke specifically. You've compared gender-affirming care to blackface. You've mocked pronouns. You've made light of violence against trans women. These aren't abstract observations about society. These are direct attacks on a vulnerable community. How is that comedy? Dave was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different. Quieter, more personal. You know what I find interesting, George? You've listed my jokes out of context, stripped of timing and nuance, and the actual craft of what I do. That's what always happens in these conversations. Someone takes a punchline, removes it from the setup, removes it from the larger piece, and presents it as a statement of belief. He stood up, and the movement commanded immediate attention. I'm not a politician. I'm not an activist. I'm not a spokesman for any community. I'm a comedian. My job is to find the edge and dance on it. To say things that people are thinking but are afraid to say. To make people laugh at things they thought they couldn't laugh at. He began pacing, his energy now filling the studio. Have I made jokes about trans people? Yes. Have I made jokes about black people? Yes. Have I made jokes about white people, Asian people, Jewish people, Muslims, Christians, rich people, poor people? Yes. 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 That's what I do. I observe humanity in all its complexity, and I find the humor in it. But why focus on trans people? George pressed. You've returned to this subject repeatedly. It seems less like observation and more like obsession. Because it's the one subject I'm told I can't talk about, Dave fired back. And that makes it interesting. Comedy has always been about testing boundaries. The moment someone tells me a topic is forbidden, that's exactly where I need to go. Not to hurt people, to understand why it's forbidden, to explore what that says about us as a society. He stopped pacing and looked directly at George. You know what I've noticed? The same people who champion free speech when it suits them become censors, when they're the subject. The same people who say comedy should speak truth to power want to silence comedy when it speaks about them. That's not liberalism, George. That's just another form of control. George's face had reened. So, you see yourself as some kind of free speech martyr? I see myself as a comedian who refuses to be told what he can and can't joke about, Dave replied. If that makes me a martyr in today's climate, that says more about the climate than it does about me. He sat back down, but his presence still dominated the room. Let me tell you something about my career. I started doing comedy in clubs where hecklers would throw things at you, where you had to earn every laugh, where nobody cared about your feelings if your jokes weren't funny. That's the tradition I come from. That's the art form I've dedicated my life to. His voice grew more passionate. Comedy isn't supposed to be safe. It isn't supposed to be comfortable. It's supposed to challenge, provoke, illuminate. The greatest comedians in history said things that made people uncomfortable. Richard Pryor talked about race in ways that horrified white America. George Carlin attacked religion and government. Lenny Bruce was arrested for obscenity. That's the lineage I'm part of. He paused, his voice taking on a reverent quality. A Chappelle's show wasn't just a sketch comedy program. It was a cultural moment. It gave Black America a voice on television that wasn't sanitized, that wasn't safe, that reflected who we actually were. We talked about race in ways that had never been done on basic cable. We made white people uncomfortable and Black people seen. That show mattered. His voice hardened again. And I've carried that responsibility my entire career to speak for people who don't have a platform. To say things that need to be said even when they're uncomfortable. To be fearless even when there are consequences. That's what comedy is supposed to do. He looked around the studio. And now I'm supposed to believe that we've evolved past the need for that. That comedy should only say things everyone already agrees with. That's not progress, George. That's the death of art. George tried another angle. But those comedians you mentioned were speaking truth to power. They were challenging the establishment. You are the establishment now. You're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You have Netflix deals most comedians can only dream of. The power dynamic has shifted. Has it? Dave asked quietly. Because last year I was attacked on stage, physically attacked by someone who disagreed with my comedy. A man rushed me while I was performing, tackled me, tried to hurt me in front of thousands of people. And you know what the response was from some quarters? That I deserved it. That my words had provoked violence against me. He let that sink in. Think about that for a second. A comedian gets physically attacked for telling jokes, and there are people who say he had it coming. That's where we are now. That's the climate you're defending when you ask me why I won't back down. The studio was absolutely silent now. I've had protests outside my shows. I've had venues threatened if they hosted me. I've had people try to end my career because of jokes. Jokes, George. Words I said on a stage to make people laugh. And you want to tell me I'm the one with all the power? He shook his head slowly. The power dynamic hasn't shifted. It's just been revealed. There are people who want to control speech, and there are people who want to defend it. I know which side I'm on. I've always known. Robin spoke up gently. Dave, I think everyone respects your commitment to your art, but isn't there a way to be provocative without hurting people? Dave turned to her with something that looked like genuine appreciation. Robin, that's a fair question, and my honest answer is, I don't know where that line is anymore. It used to be clearer, but now it seems like any joke that makes anyone uncomfortable is considered harmful. Any observation that challenges any narrative is considered violence. His voice softened. I've spent my whole life trying to make people laugh. That's all I've ever wanted to do. To walk on a stage and connect with an audience through humor to help them see the world differently for a moment, to give them relief from the heaviness of life.
He paused.
If I've hurt people, that was never my intention. But I'm not going to apologize for being a comedian. I'm not going to promise to only say things that everyone approves of, because that's not comedy. That's propaganda. He stood up again, straightening his jacket. I want to say something to everyone watching. Comedy is one of the few spaces left where difficult topics can be discussed openly, where sacred cows can be questioned, where the uncomfortable truths about our society can be explored. If we lose that space, if we decide that comedians can only say approved things, we lose something essential about what makes us human. He looked at George one final time. You came in here with an agenda. You wanted me to apologize, to back down, to promise to be more careful. But I've been doing this too long to start pretending now. I am who I am. My comedy is what it is. The audience gets to decide whether it's funny. Not activists, not corporations, not morning show hosts with political backgrounds. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I walked away from $50 million to protect my voice. You think a morning show interview is going to make me compromise it? He began walking toward the edge of the set. Wait, George called out. We're not finished. Dave stopped and turned back with an expression that mixed exhaustion and defiance. We've been finished since you decided this was going to be a trial instead of an interview. I've been tried in the court of public opinion for years now. I'm still here. I'm still performing. I'm still selling out arenas. And I'm still saying exactly what I think. He addressed the audience directly. To everyone watching who values free expression, who believes that comedy should be fearless, who thinks that difficult conversations matter, thank you. Thank you for supporting artists who refuse to be silenced. Thank you for laughing even when you're told you shouldn't. Thank you for understanding that the right to offend is essential to the right to speak at all. He nodded to Robin and Michael. It was nice to meet you both. Robin, your class act.
Michael, respect.
Then he looked at George. George, I hope someday you'll understand that what you try to do here today is exactly why people don't trust media anymore. You came with a narrative. You wanted a villain. But I've been the villain before. It doesn't scare me anymore. And with that, Dave Chappelle walked off the set of Good Morning America, leaving behind a studio that seemed to vibrate with the aftermath of what had just occurred. The audience sat in stunned silence, processing what they had witnessed. Robin Roberts looked thoughtful. Michael Strawn seemed to be suppressing a smile, and George Stephanopoulos sat in his anchor chair, looking like a man who had expected to conduct a prosecution and had instead been cross-examined. What had started as an attempt to hold a comedian accountable for his controversial material had become something far more significant. A meditation on free speech, artistic freedom, and the role of comedy in a society that increasingly wanted to control what could be said. Dave Chappelle had refused to play the role of apologetic transgressor, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone watching why he remained one of the most important voices in American culture. The aftermath of that interview would dominate social media and cultural commentary for weeks. Some praised George for asking necessary questions. Many more praised Dave for refusing to capitulate to what they saw as censorious pressure. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the conversation it sparked about comedy itself, about who gets to decide what's funny, and about the cost of speaking freely in an age that increasingly punishes dissent. Dave Chappelle had spent his career proving that he couldn't be controlled. On that morning, he proved it once again, not with anger or defensiveness, but with the same fearless clarity he brought to his stand-up. He was a comedian. He would say what he thought, and no amount of pressure would ever change that. For those who had watched Chappelle's show in college dorms, who had quoted, "I'm Rick James, bitch," until it became cultural shorthand, who had been moved by his reflections on race and identity and American hypocrisy, there was something deeply satisfying about watching him refuse to be diminished. He had never pretended to be anything other than what he was. A comedian who believed that nothing was off limits, that laughter was sacred, and that the moment you started apologizing for jokes was the moment you stopped being funny. That was the real lesson of that morning. Not about trans jokes or cancel culture or media bias, but about the simple radical act of being exactly who you are, even when the whole world tells you to be someone else. Dave Chappelle had learned that lesson when he walked away from $50 million, and he had. demonstrated it once again for free in a morning show studio in Times Square. What do you think about this incredible confrontation? Was George Stephanopoulos out of line, or was he asking necessary questions about accountability? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that will absolutely leave you speechless.